Okay, so here we are talking once again about Duncan Keith, Chicago Blackhawks defender, one of the top 100 players of all time. Yeah, that's debatable, but either way we're talking about him because we had the Elliotte Friedman tweet the other day that went over the Chicago Blackhawks and how they're apparently working on a Keith trade to either the Pacific Northwest or to Western Canada. We already spoke about the entire Vancouver angle and Seattle as well. Vancouver mostly because of the irony there with Duncan Keith and the entire history he has with this organization. But we're talking about a different team this time, and apparently this team is the one that everybody on the inside believes Duncan Keith might actually be heading to. Today we're talking about the Edmonton Oilers and whether or not they could acquire Keith in a trade. And so where is this coming from? How is it all of a sudden Edmonton that appear to be the frontrunners? Well, initially, the Friedman tweet noted Western Canada as a destination, and then we had ourselves Rick Dhaliwal, who, on the Donnie and Dolly show, had himself a segment where he highlighted what he was hearing. Everybody that he is talking to believes that Duncan Keith will be heading to Edmonton. And in the little video excerpt, I will leave a link in the description below to go ahead and watch that, he talks about how the two primary destinations that were labeled out by the agent and the player apparently happen to be Seattle and the Oilers. The perspective for Edmonton being the number one team is because that team is a little bit closer to a contention window than Seattle would be, and the chance to play with McDavid is indeed quite alluring. There were also other reasons as to why other teams weren't included, like the Vancouver Canucks in particular. This video goes over how the Canucks apparently didn't realize that Duncan Keith was even on the trade block, and the reason Keith didn't have Vancouver on his list is because of the Canucks cap issues, and it's difficult for anybody who is in a trade scenario to say, oh, I want to go to Vancouver because they could totally pay me the amount of money that I'm worth, and it would be a really easy transition to play for them because they have so much extra money to burn, right? Yeah, it's not the case here in Vancouver, so he's not really interested in that. We also had a few articles coming out on the Edmonton Journal talking about the Duncan Keith thing. This one by Kurt Levens talks about how the Oilers are the front runners in the Duncan Keith stakes. And this article, also on the Journal, talks about the mass speculation on Caleb Jones to the Blackhawks, Duncan Keith to the Oilers, and big questions on salary retention. This article, written out here by David Staples, goes over the Elliotte Friedman thing, and he also talks about what Bob Stouffer says on the edition of Oilers Now, talking about Duncan Keith and what he is hearing. Friedman says he thinks Edmonton is interested in an experienced left-shot D, the kind of older veteran like Calgary's Mark Giordano. Bob Stouffer mentioned Ryan Murray of Columbus as a possibility, but he said he wasn't as good as Keith. Bob Stouffer says that Edmonton is the target location for Keith, but that Chicago may not want to retain or take back a bad contract. His understanding is that the Hawks did not want to take any money back, and they're looking for a prospect or a pick, something to that degree, and the reason they don't want to take any money back is because they want to use the savings, and they want to get Seth Jones or Dougie Hamilton. Okay, I see. We also had Elliotte Friedman expanding on all this stuff as well. Edmonton wants to keep its cap flexibility, and Chicago wants to get another Seth Jones or Dougie Hamilton. Whatever happens in this deal, it cannot affect either of those things. There are two reasons people are zoning in on Edmonton as the Keith destination. One, it does make sense for Keith himself in a geographical and family reason, and number two, a lot of people are whispering the name of Caleb Jones. And if that's what Chicago's plan is, it makes sense. You reunite the brothers. Now that's a completely different video we're going to be talking about sometime else, but Caleb Jones might be the target because the Blackhawks would also want to acquire Seth Jones. Interesting. As for whether or not the Chicago Blackhawks would retain some of Keith's salary, Friedman says that he thinks they're negotiating that right now. Stouffer suggests that if Chicago ate a quarter of it, it might change some things for the Oilers and their fan base. Gotta remember, Duncan Keith is out here making $5.5 million until 2023. And he is no longer the number one Norris caliber guy, 30 minutes a night kind of player like he was in the 2015 playoffs, for example, where he had 21 points in 23 games played. We spoke about all this stuff in the Duncan Keith Vancouver video, but Keith is a very decorated NHL defender. He used to be able to get points for days, he had hardware for days, and he had Stanley Cups. It's kind of why he was included on that top 100 greatest players of all time list, which did not include the likes of Evgeny Malkin, Joe Thornton, Jarome Iginla, and a few other guys that are still pretty good too. So now we think about the Edmonton Oilers and what they could do with a Duncan Keith. In my opinion, Keith could honestly play pretty well in Edmonton. Barring you give him a top 4 role, you play him behind Darnell Nurse, and you manage his workload effectively. I don't know if you play him number 1 power play, but even if you don't, McDavid and Draisaitl double shift on the power play endlessly, so it's kind of fine either way. Duncan Keith knows what it means to be the anchoring defenseman on a power play with absolutely gifted offensive players. He's played with Taves and Kane for a decade and a half, so he knows what those guys are about. I have no doubt that if Duncan Keith plays in Edmonton and you pair him all of a sudden up with Draisaitl and McDavid, he's gonna know what to do. He knows what it's like to play with top talent players, and he's going to have no difference of a scenario over here. It's why the speculation is saying, okay, even though Seattle is an option as well, Edmonton is the option because Seattle just doesn't have that same contention window in the present that Edmonton seems to have. I mean, assuming they don't continue getting swept in the first round of the playoffs, because that's probably not what they want to happen. Who knows if Duncan Keith bounces back from 15 points in 54 games played this season to a little bit more of a reasonable number. I mean, he had 27 in 61 games last year and 5 in 9 in the postseason, so it's about half a point a game-ish, a 35 to 40 point pace in a regular season of 82 games. It honestly seems like somewhat of an improvement because he had 32 points in 82 games in 2017-18. So, Duncan Keith, while he isn't really the player that he was before, 69 points 10 years ago by the way, he still might be a pretty capable guy under the right circumstances. And if you're able to trade away a Caleb Jones of all people to acquire a Duncan Keith, as long as you don't add any assets that are astronomically large, I think it could be seen as a pretty nice trade for both sides. Jones is making $850,000 until next season, and he's a pretty serviceable NHL guy at the moment. He had 33 games played with the Oilers this season, and sure, he didn't suit up in the playoffs, nor did he really produce any points, but Caleb Jones seems to be the guy that would have some sort of value in the long-term future. 24 years old, he's still got some room to grow, and if you could go out there and say, okay, you really want to get Seth Jones, here's Caleb Jones, another left-handed defenseman, to maybe complement your right-handed Jones you're going to acquire, just give us Duncan Keith and we'll also send you maybe a pick or something. It could be seen as a pretty nice deal, especially if the Blackhawks are going to go out there and say, yeah, okay, cool. Let's go ahead and start this retool on the fly here. We still have Kane, we still have Taves, and we still have the young guys like Doc and DeBrincat who can help out too. Keith, sorry bud, you want to go ahead and win a cup when you're 37 gosh darn years old? Here, go to Edmonton, play with McDavid, use your experience, and we'll see how exactly that goes down in a weak Pacific Division. So all of a sudden, it starts to make a lot more sense, doesn't it? This is the one that I think, out of all the teams that have been mentioned and assumed in the Duncan Keith trade conversations, this is the one that kind of makes the most sense. Not Vancouver, because their salary cap issues are very prevalent. Not Calgary. It was actually mentioned that Calgary isn't really on that destination list, which is kind of strange, but you know what? It is what it is. I mean, I'd say I'm a lot more confident in Edmonton's window in the future compared to Calgary's either way, so that kind of makes sense in my opinion. And then, of course, Seattle, the brand new expansion team. If Duncan Keith is the guy right there in Seattle to mentor whoever it is you take at second overall on defense, like a Simon Edvinsson or a Luke Hughes or a Brent Clark or whoever gets taken. If it's a D-man, Duncan Keith could be a good veteran presence to help out that guy's development, but I mean, if Duncan Keith wants to contend as well, because he is 37, he's got 2 years left in that contract, who knows if he's going to return and sign something else afterwards, Edmonton seems like a good spot. Especially if they keep Tyson Barrie around. Duncan Keith and Tyson Barrie on the same decor? That sounds absolutely terrifying. And sure, you could say, oh, they're just kind of copying the Toronto model of loading up on all the guys that have leadership qualities and are veterans, but like, come on, that's not really what's going on here, isn't it? So talk to me in the comments what you think about this entire Duncan Keith, Caleb Jones, Seth Jones correlation over there. I think we'll expand a little bit more on Seth Jones and Dougie Hamilton in a later video, but for now, it's Duncan Keith to the Oilers. Apparently, it's the most likely scenario we have out of the few that we were presented with. Talk to me in the comments what you think about this entire idea here. Would you like to see Connor McJesus and Leon Draisaitl playing with Duncan Keith setting them up on a power play? I personally would not like to see it for my own hockey team's sake, but for an entertainment point of view, I think it sounds pretty good. Talk to me in the comments if you enjoyed this. Was Josh Rolls 99. And bye.